last week I went to a party in a barn and I had a suit and tie on. This week my staff said, just come casual and everybody's got ties on, I got a vest on. Somebody's going to have to be fired.
Not you, girl.
So I showed up in town unannounced. We got here early and I started walking around and Les is like coming right at me. And I was like, oh no, we're jaywalking. Can you get in trouble with jaywalking in Prestonsburg? And then he said, he's come over here. And it's like, there's been a water main busted. He wants me to help him with the asphalt. And before I know, my shoes are all muddy. But we got it all fixed. Actually, he did most of the work before I got here. So, but they say a recession is when someone else loses their job. A depression is when you lose your job. But a recovery is when Dr. Anthony Fauci loses his job. The media misinterprets this and thinks it's something personal. It isn't personal at all for me. But 5 million people died around the world. Over 750,000 Americans died. Shouldn't we want to know where the virus came from? I started out actually believing the other side. There was, I'm in medicine. I went to medical school. I've done medical research. I've studied immunology. I've studied virology. And I was like, well, these scientists all said that it had to have come from animals. And I was like, okay, 70 scientists, all these famous scientists. And then 6 months later, we learned that the guy who organized the letter was the guy funding the research in Wuhan. You think he might have a little bit of a conflict of interest? Do you think Fauci might have a conflict of interest in wanting to cover up? Because if we find out that our money went to Wuhan, and Wuhan created a virus that didn't exist in nature, that it got out and infected the world, do you think there might be some blame for Anthony Fauci? Absolutely. But he acts incredulous. He acts incredulous as if, who, me? How can it be me? He says, gain of function? Oh, that's no longer on our website. Literally, they sent a letter to us about 3 weeks ago to Congressman Comer and myself, and they said, well, we don't perform gain of function, and we don't approve of gain of function, but they did create some viruses, and we mixed them together, and yeah, they're more dangerous now, and they were killing the heck out of the humanized mice. This is mice that are human, half mice, but anyway, it killed the mice, and yes, it did increase in lethality, it increased in its dangerousness, but it wasn't gain of function. Why? Because we took that off the website yesterday. Don't you look at our website. They literally took gain of function off of the website and they call it something else. The first letter from the 70 scientists, I should have known better once I read the letter. It said it absolutely came from animals, and if you think it came from a lab, you're a conspiracy theorist. So if you haven't been called a conspiracy theorist this week, you're not trying. So what is the evidence it came from animals versus the evidence that it came from a lab? Well, one of the biggest pieces of information is they tested 80,000 animals from the wet market. I don't know what a pangolin is, and I'm not eating one. But over there, they eat a lot of pangolins and other bizarre creatures, and they come from a wet market, so they're there, and they think that viruses could come from them to us. They tested 80,000 animals from the wet markets. 0. No animals had COVID. They took COVID that infects us and they tried to infect bats with it. That's where they come. The viruses come from bats. They tried to infect the disease that's affecting us into bats. The bats wouldn't take it. It's more adapted to us than it is to bats. But if it just came from animals in the last year, it should readily affect and should be a reservoir of it somewhere. It had to come from somewhere. That's why they kill all the chickens and stuff. They find the virus in them. They have to kill all the chickens. But they haven't found any animal, not one animal, 0 animals. So I read an article the other day by a guy named Stephen Quay in the Wall Street Journal, and he's good at compiling this stuff. He's a biostatistician, and he's really looked at it. Well, apparently they looked at 9,000 samples of blood from China, including Wuhan, from 2019, taken from people who were in the hospital with the flu. So in 2019, we didn't know about COVID. But if this came from animals, it didn't just come out and cause the pandemic. It would have had to start somewhere, and it would percolate at least a little bit, a couple of months. They tested 9,000 samples of blood from people who had the flu in 2019 in China. 0. None of them had COVID. The statisticians predict that there should have been 300 to 400 people out of 9,000. Not everybody, but there'd be a few. There'd be a couple hundred. 0. So no animals and no people had it. Turns out there were a few workers in the lab and they had it. But they won't admit that, but they had flu-like symptoms about that period of time. But this is a real problem. There's a lack of honesty. But it isn't still about culpability. It isn't about me blaming Fauci and Fauci accepting the blame. Although it's a little bit to that. But it's really about, what if this happens again? What if it's worse the next time? This virus has a 1% mortality. They started out telling you it was 3 or 4. They weren't right, but it's about 1. And 1's nothing to sneeze at. I know 2 or 3 people have died. If I ask you to raise hands, people will know people in town who died. It's not something to slough off. That's why I'm so mad that we might have paid for it. It's bad enough to have something terrible in your community, but it's another thing to say, oh yeah, and here's the bill for it. But the thing is we're still doing this research. We're still funding it in Wuhan. But we also fund it in North Carolina, and we fund it in Galveston. And they're taking viruses, not with 1% mortality, but with 15% mortality. So SARS, S-A-R-S, was a coronavirus from 2004. It had a 15% mortality. There's another virus, MERS, M-E-R-S, has 50% mortality. They're wanting to take those viruses and mix them with unknown viruses that they get scooping up the guano out of a bat cave in South China. They want to mix them together. They have no idea what they're going to get. They create viruses that do not exist in nature. But they're saying, well, we want to study these in case the next pandemic comes out of this bat cave. Well, guess what? Nature is random. So if something evolves out of that bat cave, it's not going to be what you created. When men mix things together and they get this, well, nature mixes thousands of things together and you have no idea. It's a random thing. The chances that nature's going to create what man created is very small. But you have to listen to Fauci closely. Fauci said in 2012, he said, gain-of-function research is so important. He said, sure, if a scientist gets infected and a pandemic occurs, that could happen. But if we looked at it, the risk would be worth it. He needs to tell that to 5 million people and their families who died in this thing. I don't think the risk is worth it. In fact, the creation of the vaccine shows that we can now create a vaccine in a month. And not everybody here is going to be, for taking the vaccine. That's your business. I think the vaccine is saving lives. It's not perfect. But I think if you're over a certain age or over a certain body weight, the vaccine's a good thing. It may save your life. People misinterpret this from me all the time. The reporters come down the hall, and they're kind of like pests. They're kind of like something you need some spray for them or something. But they come down the hall and they say, so-and-so got COVID. They weren't vaccinated. They're sick. Or so-and-so got really sick. Or if someone dies, they're gleeful. There was a radio host out of Nashville. I used to be on his program, Phil Valentine. He died. Shouldn't we be sad when someone dies? They stomp on his grave and want to make, what a terrible person because he wasn't vaccinated. It's like, I'm a doctor. If you come to me and if you smoked cigarettes, I'm not going to spend the whole time telling you how terrible you are. You take care of people. If you're overweight or have this problem or this problem, you have a heart attack because you don't exercise, whatever. Is it my job to tell you you're a terrible human first before I take care of you? Or maybe we don't take care of people who have heart attacks or overweight. Maybe we only take care of marathon runners who have heart attacks. Maybe we should prioritize who we take care of. This is a ridiculous world. We've never lived in that kind of world. But when we look at this, we have to be very much aware that this is an ongoing thing, and the failure of Fauci to admit that he funded it, the failure of him to admit that it's dangerous, means that it could happen again and we can't fire him soon enough. There have been other ramifications of this. We got kids outside playing in the playground with masks on. There's absolutely no science to support that mask mandates have reduced or changed the incidence of the disease at all. If you look from state to state, And from country to country, when they instituted mask mandates, the incidence of the disease does this, and it doesn't change. Now, eventually it comes down. Once about everybody's been infected in your community, it comes down. Then it may go back up if you have another variant, it comes down. The masks have had nothing to do with it. The social distancing, nothing to do with it. Scott Gottlieb was the head of the FDA. You know what he said about the social distancing? He said if you're in a small room, and this happened, there were people in choir practice in a fairly small room with 30 or 40 people singing, and half of them got the disease. If you're in there long enough with people, it spreads. Not to the people next to you, it spreads throughout the whole room. One of the best things you can do if we wanted to do anything for our schools would be good filtration systems. The airlines really haven't had much spread. But if you ask yourself, oh gosh, I love my children, and I don't want my children to get sick. Children largely don't die from this. There have been a few, but less than we get from the seasonal flu. But if you want to know whether masks work for kids, in Sweden, 1.8 million children, it's about 18% of their population, 1.8 million children, none of them wear masks, and they haven't worn masks for 2 years. They didn't wear masks during any of this. 1.8 million children. How many deaths? 0. Well, you say, well, we got to protect the teachers, though. The teachers will all get it from the kids, and they'll all die. And that's what the teachers are telling us. That's not true. They looked at the incidence of the disease and of death among teachers, and it's absolutely no different than any other profession of people who don't deal with kids. So we should look at the science. The left says, look at the science, look at the science. Well, they don't obey any of their science. On the masks, Dr. Fauci said the truth at first. He said, they don't work. We found in public settings they don't work. And he told people privately, you know, those cloth masks, the holes are about this big and the virus is about this big. The virus goes right through. And then he changed his mind. So first he told you no masks work. 3 weeks later he says all the masks work. And then he's got them all over his face. He's got 3 or 4 masks on, got them on his head. He's like, oh, I think if you wear 6 masks, you got a much better chance. But he's not being honest with you. He's telling you sort of what they call a platonic lie. He's telling you a lie or a noble lie because he doesn't think you're smart enough to handle the truth. The truth is the masks are different. But by doing so, they accuse us of your misinformation could cause people to die. Well, his misinformation actually is causing people to die, and I'll tell you how. If you are 75 years old and your spouse has COVID, you're going to stay there and take care of them, which most of us would do, and you're going to be intimately around them taking care of them. Don't wear a cloth mask. They don't work. The N95 masks work. You have to be very, very careful. You can't touch them. Can't have any air around the outside. You probably have to wear gloves. You have to throw them away on every use. That's what they do in the hospital. But nobody in the hospital wears a cloth mask in the COVID room. They don't work. So by telling you they work, they're actually giving you misinformation that might cost your life. How else is he costing lives? He's costing lives throughout the entire world. So in India, they didn't have enough vaccines. And vaccines do help, but so does natural immunity. It's the combination of those of us who've gotten infected and those of us who've been vaccinated. When there's enough of us, we'll stop the disease. Unless it continues to mutate, but I mean, there's a chance we can stop this disease. But by ignoring the natural immunity you get from the disease, he's telling everybody to get in line. Well, if you got 1 billion people in India, and you got 400 million doses of vaccine, wouldn't you want people in the line first who haven't had the disease? So tens of thousands of people have inevitably died in India because people were in the line who had already gotten the disease. We knew this years ago. George Washington knew when he sent Martha to get the vaccine for smallpox that he didn't need it because he had pox all over his face. He had scars because when he was 15 he went to Barbados and he got smallpox, and they knew back then you didn't get it again. Now it's not always perfect. I mean, there are some diseases you can get again. But with smallpox it was pretty perfect. With measles it's pretty perfect. And with this disease it's probably going to be pretty good. They studied 2.5 million people in Israel. And what did they find? If you've been vaccinated, good. If you're unvaccinated but had COVID already, guess what? You're even better. You're 7 times better, maybe 27 times better. But once again, this isn't a message not to get the vaccine. It's not a message to get COVID. It's not a benign disease. But if you tell me you already had it, why shouldn't somebody listen to you? Why shouldn't it count for something? How is a vaccinated immunity better than a natural immunity? We don't know that. And you know what they'll say? They'll say, it could wear off. You don't know when yours is going to wear off, because I had it over a year ago. And I said, well, you don't know when your vaccine's going to wear off. How do you know any better than what I know? And it's my choice. I still might get vaccinated. I haven't. My wife did. My wife's the same age. She's healthy. She made the decision to get vaccinated. I still might. I'm kind of waiting for, if the Delta variant sticks around, I'm waiting for the Delta variant vaccine, which they have. But apparently they got to sell all the stuff they got out there, the old one that doesn't work as well, and I'd rather have the new one that works better when it comes out. But science was never about being directed by the government. We direct a lot of the research, and this is why we have one opinion now. It's why on climate, or what I call climate alarmism, you have one opinion. Why? It's all funded by Dr. Fauci. It's all funded by one central source. You cannot work for a university and get a grant that wants to look objectively about what's going on. You can't objectively say, well, climate has been changing a long time. I mean, there were those glaciers, remember? And then there weren't, and then there were again, then they weren't, and they were. We've been through this cycle of glaciation over millions of years. That's nature. And then there's man and carbon. And I'm like, well, carbon might have something to do with it, but I don't know. So I ask people, is man 5% of the problem and nature still 95% of the cycles of nature, of climate? Or is it the opposite? Is man 95% and nature 5%? I've never seen one person explain to me why nature no longer has anything to do with the climate cycle and it's all man. And then the one good thing that's happened that has reduced the carbon footprint is fracking and cheap natural gas, which I know we don't always like that out here, but it has reduced the carbon footprint. And what do the left hate more than anything? Fracking. So they don't want a cleaner environment. They just really are against progress in general. As we got COVID, though, we began to lose our freedoms. You lost your freedom with masking. You're going to lose your freedom with vaccination, too. I'm not against vaccination, but if I had a 10-year-old kid and they had COVID 3 months ago, hell no, I wouldn't vaccinate them. But if you want to, I would never tell you not to, and I would never say you're a bad person for doing it. That's up to you. I just think it hasn't been fully studied in people who've already had the disease getting revaccinated. You get about 1,000 times greater response. You might be, wow, I'd like to be 1,000 times more immune. Maybe, but maybe for the kid's immune system, it might be enough to cause a side effect like the myocarditis. I'd want to study it. Most of the vaccine studies on children exclude people who have already had COVID from the trial. So you don't know if it's safe in the people who have already had COVID, because they don't want them in the study because they acknowledge natural immunity. If they've already had COVID, it doesn't matter if you give them a vaccine, they don't get COVID. It's not a valid result, so we exclude them from the study. But you still need to know if it's safe, and it's probably going to be. But I still don't want everybody to be told to do it. Just because I pay taxes doesn't mean you can make all kinds of host of rules where my kid can't. I've already paid my taxes. I can't play football, they can't go to band, they can't go to school. I mean, what's going to happen here? You know what's happened in the last year in schools? We found that the poor kids that don't have as good a support system, the kids who can't afford to escape to either a private school or another school or be homeschooled or have their parents helping them learn virtually, have dropped further and further behind. In Louisville, where 30% of the 12-year-olds can read, it's gotten worse. Now it's 20%. So none of this is helping the people they say they want to help. It's actually hurting all of us. We have to try to get our freedoms back. We can't let this persist. But we have to keep fighting them every day on what the science is, because they say the science is one thing and we say it's another. And to tell you the truth is, that's how a debate occurs. In the law, in the courtroom, the truth is arrived at by the adversarial process. And we take that for granted, but if you've ever been on a jury, you hear facts on one side, you hear facts on both sides, and sometimes both the facts are true, but now it's the interpretation of how it fits together to find justice. It's an adversarial process. Science is the same way. If you go to a scientific convention, you used to, you'd hear heated debates, scientists on one side saying this, and that's how we arrive at the truth. But your local doctors have to have the freedom to decide what to do. People ask me about ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. I don't know the answer. I'm agnostic on it. I don't have a dog in that fight. But I wouldn't prevent people from trying it. I wouldn't prevent doctors from giving it. I personally think the one thing you all need to know about, if you get it, and if you're vaccinated, you can still get it. If you get it, The monoclonal antibodies is a 70 to 80% reduction in your hospitalization and death. But you have to ask early. Why? Because Dr. Fauci has set the rules. The government is directing all of medicine, and I don't want to accuse anybody locally in the hospital or doctors, but I know of communities where you go in and they say we can't do this because the CDC guidelines say we can't do it. So if you're an inpatient, the official CDC guideline is you cannot get monoclonal antibodies. So it's like, okay, you're sick, you're gasping for air, and they're saying you need to go to the hospital, and you're like, no, but wait a minute, stop in the ER. See if I can get the life-saving treatment before you admit me and deny me the life-saving treatment. Seriously, I know people have been admitted, and then they're having I read the sad case. This is from a doctor, a famous orthopedic surgeon in Nashville. His friend died. She was 49 years old. They said that he tried everything he could to get her transferred to another hospital. She's either not sick enough or too sick. He'd get a different answer every day. They finally told her at one point, where she was still talking and texting, she could be discharged, but she'd have to do it against medical advice. This is a real bully tactic. It happens in medicine, but it's kind of a crummy thing to say you want a second opinion, and they won't give you the second opinion. You can leave if you want to go against medical advice, which means you're a terrible cretin and you're unwilling to believe in modern medicine. This person, had they gotten monoclonal antibodies, might have survived. Had they gotten something, the inhaled steroids are also a reasonable thing to think about. But I'm not here to tell you what to do. There are treatments out there. The bottom line is you got to get them early. If you wait too long, they won't give them to you. This is the problem ultimately of socialism versus capitalism. In socialism, you have centralized planning. In capitalism, we have a dispersion of decision making. The reason the marketplace is so important and so smart is nobody can fathom what happens every day. The price of bread. I can't tell you what the price of bread is today or should be tomorrow or the next day. There is no correct price of bread. It's supply meeting demand, and it crosses, and the marketplace of capitalism efficiently gets bread out. But if you set the price of bread too high, it'll rot on the shelves. If you set it too low, it'll be gone. It's feast or famine. Only capitalism brings supply and demand to meet. It's the same way with medicine. You don't have centralized authority, you disperse it. It's what my dad used to always say about liberty. He said, liberty brings us together because we don't have to all agree. I've just agreed, like, if you don't agree with anything I said on COVID, that's fine, because I'm not telling you to do any of it. You have your opinion. In a free society, we all make decisions different. Depends on your age, depends on your body weight, depends on how sick you are, depends on you talking to your doctor or your second doctor or your third opinion. That's what liberty's about. But the other side doesn't get it at all. I had dinner with somebody from one of the big tech companies. I won't say the name, Google. But I told him, I said, I see you guys as the medieval church with Galileo. And they see us the opposite. Talk about being separated and not understanding each other. I see them as the medieval church. I've been banned from YouTube for saying cloth masks don't work. One of Biden's coronavirus advisors said the same thing, but he didn't get banned. I got banned for saying something on the Senate floor about a certain impeachment of a former president. And my speech got taken down. It was on the Senate floor, protected by the Constitution. But we have to get away from centralizing the authority. We have to get back to the dispersion of knowledge and the dispersion of freedom among ourselves. We live in the greatest nation known to mankind. Greatest nation in all of recorded history. Great because we're the freest. Great because we were left alone. Great because our founding fathers wrote down and codified the idea that rights come from your Creator, that they pre-exist, that government was ordained among men to protect those rights. Wasn't ordained among men to take one of your cars and give it to somebody else. Wasn't ordained among men to take your property or your rights or tell you your kids can't go to school without a mask, or they can't even go to a religious school, a private school, or to church, or that you can't go to church. That might not be advisable to go to church, but that's your business. Listen to the news, make your own decision. But the thing is, it's not the government's right. Every time the governor has gotten involved, he's been struck down. He even tried to overturn the state legislature. We went 9 months with his edicts, his royal edicts. Actually call him DWP, drunk with power. But in the end, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously. They ruled unanimously that the legislature has the right to restrict emergency powers. They gave him the emergency powers, and all they did was simply say, at the end of 30 days, you got to come to us, and they have to be approved by the legislature. It's the biggest battle of my lifetime, and to the state legislators who are here, I think we should all congratulate them for fighting for our freedom. We have to understand what made America great. There was this candidate, I can't remember him, Make America Great Again, that guy. And that's great. But in order to make America great again, we need to know what made America great in the first place. I like the hat, by the way. What made us great was the idea that our rights were given to us by a creator and enshrined in a document, the Constitution. We went from a society where 99% of the world lived in extreme poverty, hand-to-mouth, barely enough food, to a world now where less than 10% of the world lives in extreme poverty. Doesn't mean there's not poverty, but the poor people in our country are the middle class in most of the rest of the world. It happened because of capitalism, voluntarism, being left alone, from a small government that leaves you alone to sell your wares, your services, etc. I'm incredibly proud of this country. I will continue to fight. I'm not giving up. I won't be quiet. I won't be silenced. And I know you'll be there with me. Thank you very much.